Don Thilmany McFadden is a professor in the Department of Agricultural Resource Economics at Colorado State University. And Don's specialty is in the economics of value-added market differentiation of food products, such as local, organic, and specialty products. At CSU, she teaches courses on agricultural finance, agricultural marketing, business management, and consumer demand theory. Having grown up on a farm in the Midwest, Don knows agriculture from the inside out. Help me welcome Dr. Don Thilmany. Get you queued up here.
Well, thanks for getting all your hard questions out of the way. I'm feeling refreshed. I'm so happy to see a lot of familiar faces. So for some of you, you've heard me speak before. Today's tone will be slightly a bit more focused on organic. But as a warning, I might be slightly lower than the 30,000 level view, but I go just about as fast as the planes that travel at that. So if I'm going too fast or some of this, fine to even have me stop and clarify with questions in the middle of it. But I'm really going to try to give you not just a high-level overview, but I've been at CSU long enough that we've actually had quite a program looking at these consumer-based issues primarily, that I'm going to touch on a lot of them, all which give you a slightly different flavored insight into what's going on, in our opinion, with organic markets. So my major talking points today are to look at the dynamics of the organic market. Some of the data, especially on the consumer side, we have a little more timely than the supply side. Look at particularly what we've done exploring the consumer's role in shaping organic agriculture and food markets, and then maybe a little bit at the end about what that might mean for ag and food managers. That'll also play nicely with some of the discussion points from the value chain. So if you look at the most recent report, and this is literally less than a month old, we don't have it at state level yet, but we do know at the national level. We have actually at the global level, 25,000 certified organic operations in 120 countries. USDA, through its programs we're going to hear about from Mark later today, has helped an additional 763 producers get certified, and we have seen a market increase. We expect nothing but probably seeing at least that level of increase here in the state, if not faster, just because of some of being a part of that innovation cluster that they defined. But if you look at some of Vilsack's comments when he announced some of this data, what he really harped on, and I'm going to discuss today, is that this has been a very consumer-driven industry. So just like Cathay said, people spend money on what excites them. The consumers have pulled this industry along, in my opinion, and that's why we've decided to focus on it. It is a very hard supply side transition. And so farmers really do need to be incentivized to take on that risk. And the consumers, in my opinion, have done their job here. But when you get a little more in depth there, we have to think about all the dimensions of what consumers think about when they're buying food. So we're going to try to go through several points on that today. So this is a nice schematic that the Organic Trade Association put together. Lots of data embedded in there. It's a great graphic. But you'll see everything from how big the industry is. Somewhere 31 to 40 billion now is what we guess. But if you I can't go through all of them, but if you look through there, what we're also seeing is a lot of what we call market penetration. A lot of households now do at least some organic buying, and that was not the case 20 years ago. And then we have some really core organic consumers, but a lot of households are doing at least a little organic purchasing. And again, they're the ones pulling along those markets and getting people to incentivize to make changes. So if you look at some of the statistics you pull out of there, again, the best guess is we're somewhere between 35 and 40 billion in the organic market, and that's a significant growth increase. What's really interesting about organic is that it just keeps not slowing down. People keep expecting it to mature and slow down. We have not seen slightly slower during the recession, but not at all what people expected. And so it's been a very, very solid growth pattern, and that takes some of the risk away because it tells people this isn't a flash in the pan. This is a marketplace that's been very stable. We're continuing to get new consumers, and we're pulling some other consumers in with us. Globally, there's growth happening as well. Not quite as good of data or frequent of data, but it is a substantial market. But as Greg says, this is all in context. It's still a relatively small share of what's going on in food markets, but we as economists often like to look at the most dynamic portions of the market. This is a dynamic portion of the market. So if you look at the 2013 trends that the Hartman Group pulled out, there's a couple of places that might enter in this discussion today that are key trends they pointed out. Social media is this disruptive force now. And that isn't directly related to organic, but what I think you see happening in a lot of the conversations in social media are about value-driven food systems. And so it does play into how consumers might have their perceptions flavored or changed. We see food competition everywhere. And what I mean by that is a lot of our discussions even today are going to be how people make choices at grocery stores. But they're not just eating at grocery stores. They're eating at grocery stores and restaurants and food carts and vending machines and who knows what all we're going to see evolve in the next 10 years. So we have to remember that this is all in the perspective of organic is changing at the same time the whole food system is changing. And then finally, sustainability in the good company or farm ranch. People are putting lots of values on their food decisions compared to 20 years ago. Stepping back even further, what are we eating at all? Well, this is kind of a good schematic of approximately what we're eating in our U.S. diets. It does not line up with my plate, but I decided not to be political and put those next to each other. We have our big dairy cow there, which will make a couple people in the audience happy. But this is just what we're eating, and realize this is still broken down by ingredients. But what Greg told us already, and I'm going to harp on more, is fewer and fewer households are buying ingredients. More and more households are buying ingredients turned into foods. And so that makes the organic dimension even more complex. And we'll discuss that as we go through here. So on the left-hand side, you've probably seen this schematic before, but it's the food dollars broken up into who gets those food dollars. Just a very different representation than what Greg already told you. But what you see is approximately 11 cents is going to the food and ag producer. And another dynamic we're going to talk about later, which is the local food movement, it's kind of been a response to trying to pull some of that food dollar back to farms and ranches by letting them be part of their own supply chain. There are economic implications for that too, including it's costly to market your own stuff. But one of the real dynamic tensions right now is between local and organic, and that's because the local movement is really about getting the farmer more of that dollar. The organic movement might also be about that, but the organic movement is about, it can be just as much applied to processed foods and restaurant foods as what we're going to call the shorter supply chains. On the right-hand side, and this is the reality, is in Colorado we're pretty close to half of our food dollars being spent at restaurants. You guys are actually lower than average, which surprised me a little bit. Fort Collins is like one of the top 5 in the country for eating out as a percentage of their food dollars. If you've lived there, you'll notice that there's restaurants everywhere. But what's the reality is that when we start talking about foods and food supplies, those restaurants are all having to triple the cost of whatever food ingredients they're buying. That's their business model. So when you start talking about using particularly the restaurant industry, which is a huge share of the buying dollar now, to be part of the organic movement, when you put premiums on the organic products going to them, realize the reality of what that means for that multiplier effect. And that's one thing a lot of my people who are looking at reinventing supply chains don't realize is the restaurants are a big, strong player, but their economic reality is everything you want to get for a stronger food dollar from them is going to be ramped up when it's faced by the consumer. And so that's been a real challenge and barrier to us seeing organic penetrate that segment as fully as it's penetrated retail markets. These are all just important things to note because we have to pay attention to how consumers are thinking even before we drill down to organics. And they're spending a lot of money away from home and not cooking nearly as much with raw ingredients. So if you do look at what's happening with organics in particular sectors, the data itself only went through 2008, but this graphic is good because it at least put a pretty good forecast up to 2010. And not surprising, fruit and vegetables and dairy are the lead categories for organics, and not only have always been the biggest, but also continue to see strong growth. Those are raw ingredients, again, primarily. But you do see some of the categories where it's a little more complex to put together an organic supply chain are coming along strongly, particularly beverages, bakery industry, and to a lesser degree meats, but meats compared to where they were a decade ago have made great progress. Again, so now these aren't all raw ingredients. Some of these start being the things that people might get that are more ready to eat, but it's still all within the retail food sector, which again is only half of the food dollars. This is the one good graphic I found on the supply side, and this is just a U.S. graphic of how big the organic industry is in each of these states. And different things mean, different colors mean different things. The darker the state, the more numbers of operations you have. And notice it's mostly still a coastal thing. We're a little shaded yellow. The size of the circle is the amount of acres certified organic. And then whether it's light green versus dark green means it's more like cropland. The light green means it's more pasture land, so that's usually a little easier to transition and a little lower value. But you can see Wyoming, our northern neighbor, actually really ramped up primarily through pasture land. And we're, again, for being a non-coastal state, a pretty big player relatively in this country. And then we have the southeast where organic has just not caught on. And there's a lot of reasons for that we can discuss over lunch. Because we're going to talk about local here a little bit, I wanted to give you the last graphic we have on the value of direct sales. Again, it's mostly a coastal phenomenon, but Colorado has some of our pockets of activity. And when these come out, whenever they come out, the government shutdown slowed the census. I expect the growth pattern in local to be very similar to what we've seen in organic, possibly even double digit. And our state has had one of the highest growth patterns. And local and organic are complementary, but we also find that they're actually competitive in the consumer's eyes. So we'll talk about that. So what is the challenge here really for organics? Before I jump into some consumer research, well, USDA has had a very long-standing presence as being a certifier of grades and standards. But up until probably the last 3 decades, it was primarily on these things that really related to a measurable product quality, or a safety measure about it's safe for human consumption. Organic was really the first place where we saw it being pushed into the realm of, but what if there's other stuff that matters about the system it's grown in, and how its impacts might be for the environment or public health. And so the USDA has been very slow in wrangling with this, and part of it is that they need to be guided by, well, what do people think they're getting with this label? And some of it's been guided by the science of what the supply side says you should have with that label. And that tension's been very real. And most of my perspective on that, again, is what do consumers think they're getting when they're buying it, and how should the standards be measured, evaluated, critiqued, and updated based on that? So this is something I can't take credit from. This is the Hartman Group, but this is a schematic they did from a bunch of focus groups. You probably can't read all that print if at least you got my level of eyesight. But what it shows you is that organic and natural actually came up a similar number of times when they brought up what's clean food. They just randomly said clean food. And then if you look at the things that are associated with those terms, organic almost sounds too scientific, too technical for what people really want to feel good about, which is food and culture, whereas natural seems to have made some gains. And this has been a very contentious point, because some people feel natural doesn't mean anything. But apparently to consumers it does, and you do not want to go out there telling consumers they're stupid. That almost never ends well, unless they've had an open bar for about 5 hours. But and you'll notice local is popping out there too. And again, I can share these with anybody. We don't have time to go through it, but it's very interesting to start getting into the perspective of what consumers think when you pull out different terms. And organic is there, but if you look at the terminology around organic, it is not exactly what a food culture hopes to have resonate in a consumer's head when they're thinking of their product. So really, this all leads to the very, very rapidly changing marketing landscape and what we call food labels. And they've become very proliferated. They've been very hard for us to keep up with understanding how people view them and use them differently. But most of our research that I'm going to go over now does focus on just that. So here's a poster I put together. And what you'll see is whenever anybody looks at this, they always make organic as kind of the granddaddy of all of this. And we start out with what is organic. And then for all of the other labels that proliferated, we almost always make it a comparison. How are they different than that granddaddy label organic? And this is just a small set of the categories that you now can see supported by USDA Ag Marketing Service programs to allow for third-party certification. And because there's been such a proliferation and no one wants to give up their turf, there's been tension among these segments. We already heard about that segmentation of big, more corporate agriculture and small organic agriculture, but there's even different factions of organic agriculture, and anyone who doesn't believe that hasn't driven around the state very much. But we also have organic against local, we have animal welfare versus organic and animal products, which don't mean the same thing. So almost all the questions we get asked and choose to examine usually have to do with the tensions among, or complementarities among these segments. So we're going to start off with looking at a little bit about what we've learned about Colorado public attitudes. If you were at the forum, Adrian and I did a more thorough discussion of this, but the Colorado Department of Agriculture does track what people feel about food and agriculture. And the first thing to highlight is consistently across the last 20 years, agriculture fares very well in people's eyes in terms of its role in their quality of life, being the highest and best use of water and land, and its affordability and safety. So overall, people are pretty happy with the food system. One example of that is people feel like they get food for a reasonable price. Now, this could get very political, and you could say, well, the reason it's a reasonable price is we're subsidizing bad models of food, and I've heard all of those discussions. The reality is it was a goal of our country to make food affordable for as many people as possible. And the whole reason we're seeing alternative markets grow and be strong is because this became so much less expensive that people then say, well, I actually have some residual income left. I'm going to go spend it on some higher quality things and dimensions that are important to me. So the organic market is big and strong, but it also kind of relies on that a huge portion of people's food budget is still pretty affordable to them, and that gives them the money to go and now invest in food purchases and models of agriculture and food that may be more expensive, but they're afforded that luxury of it being more expensive because they baseline didn't spend that much on food. And that's a complex thing, but it's a reality of our system as it exists right now. And when we asked people what was important to them with food, freshness was obviously first, but price is up there. Not for everybody, but for over half the sample, it was the most important thing. And the reality is, for organic, it was not a major thing. There is a small faction of people it's a very important thing, and they're a very important part of the market to serve. And they're the people incentivizing some of this, but relative to some of the other things, they're not as important. But you'll notice a couple of those things up above could be interactive with organic. You might say, I support the local economy because I'm buying organic and that organic producer is 5 miles away. And that's what we started digging in again with our consumer research. Now, if we drill down to a Boulder County survey that Adrian shared that you guys helped support here, we do have a higher share of this county probably buying organic more often, but we still do have a barrier, and the particular barrier is the cost. And that is because right now, at the scale and level that they're operating, most organic foods are more costly for people to buy than their counterparts. And then there's some people who feel like there's really not much of a difference, or it's an availability problem, but it's primarily a cost issue, or a perceived cost issue at least. So the first thing that we looked at, we're going to flip to some research that we've done at CSU, is starting to get to the bottom of what people do when they see that USDA organic label. We kind of built off of what that Hartman Group visual was. What did they think about? So we gave them a survey where they literally had a bar of placed in the middle for they're just neutral about organic. But when you think about organic, does it make you feel like it improves or worsens air pollution, improves or worsens animal welfare? And we had a whole set of variables we asked about that. We did the same thing for Validus, which is an animal certification program, and this was a project sponsored by Aurora Organic. I should give them credit. And we asked them about Colorado Proud, which is our local designation. And what we found is we made these webs, and let me walk you through these webs. These webs basically say the farther the blue spike goes out, the more they aligned organic with that concept. So here, they definitely align organic with sustainable ag. That spike comes out very, very far towards the outside of the rim. But they also kind of affiliate it with animal welfare, kind of affiliate it with nutrition, kind of affiliate it with taste. It's kind of an amorphous blob. It's kind of good news because it means a lot of different people looking for a lot of different things think organic might have a positive outcome for them. Them buying organic will lead to these things being better. But it's also a problem because it's so multidimensional, it might be confusing. There's not a clean signal. Whereas if you go to this schematic on Colorado Proud, it's pretty unidimensional. It's about supporting local. So it doesn't get all those people who are fans of all those other dimensions, but everyone who wants local knows this is their lightning rod label. And can you see the complexity of that for organic? So this tells you a lot of people think it's kind of good in some dimensions, but it's not clean in any one of them. And that's, we did that research after seeing the Hartman thing just to say there's actually a label challenge here for organic. And so part of the challenge in incentivizing people to change is whether consumers really are getting that clean signal they want, or are we going to see some producers who just lean more towards this local concept because that's clean in the consumer's eyes. And there's a lot of Colorado buying dollars that can actually use this kind of labeling schematic as well. Going a little deeper, and this is going to start getting hairy, but I'll try to translate it. We actually do experiments where we actually put a couple of products side by side, put prices on them, give them different labeling dimensions, and we say, which one would you choose if you were at a supermarket and they were side by side? We also let them opt out. We do a whole bunch of stuff statistically, so we see lots of combinations, and it allows us to see what basically consumers' part worth value for that label is. And so we did this in 2008 with both apples and tomatoes. So this is an example of the choice they'd be given. At that time, there was no carbon footprint label, so us supremely talented graphic artists that are economists came up with that. Sorry. And then for fair trade, we also made one. There was a fair trade a program at the time, but it was not well known in most parts of the country, so we couldn't use it. But this was an example of a choice they'd be given. All of this allowed us to come down with some part worth values, and I'll share with you what we found for tomatoes instead of apples. But the other dimension that's interesting here is you'll see organic and local actually secured about the same premium in most consumers' eyes. The other dimension we added here, though, if you see the different colored bars, we're really starting to find where people shop. Tells you a lot about what they're willing to pay for products with different labels. And we've spent a lot of time with direct markets up at Fort Collins. So the blue bar is people who spend at least 25% of their food dollars at direct markets, CSAs, roadside stands, buying freezer beef, and the rest at supermarkets. They're about 13% of the population. The by far largest group of people is the supermarket direct people, the red bars. Those are well over half of the population, and you'll see their premiums are a little less, and that's why you might see when you go to farmers markets, farmers securing a slightly better price than if you see the products being marketed at the supermarkets. But what and then the supermarket HN is people who also shop at health and natural food stores like Vitamin Cottage or Alfalfa's or Whole Foods. And so what you'll see is they have very similar margins to them, but we all know they're very different supply chains. And they both have the pros and cons. So there definitely is a little bit of tension or competition between those two segments. Carbon footprint wasn't registering with people at all yet. And then on the import side, you can see the biggest discount for imports came from people buying directly. Obviously, they have locally driven motivations for their food dollar purchases. The other element we added to this, because a consumer psychologist approached me, was how consumer psychologists would view this. And the concept they introduced me to is this concept at the bottom of perceived consumer effectiveness. Everybody used to think people maybe were driven by social norms of, well, my friends are doing it. And we found some evidence of that. But the new thing that we got introduced to was the perceived consumer effectiveness, which is almost like a consumer confidence measure. But unlike the usual consumer confidence measure that as economists use, which is how far will my food dollar go, this one is, if I want a social outcome out of my purchase, how confident am I'm actually going to, my consumer activism is going to matter. It's a very interesting dimension, and we found lots of interesting evidence that it's pretty pervasive among consumers. So what we found, without having to pay too much attention to the statistics, is that people did pay higher premiums for organic and local products if their perceived consumer effectiveness was high, that their consumer dollars would make a change in the world. And just to break it down, that's a big lump term, perceived consumer effectiveness, but it can be broken down into several dimensions. And the one that scored the highest was health. That's not surprising. People can actually measure whether their health is improving. Their blood pressure is down, their weight is down. And then impact of local economy, they may feel like they can measure that because they say, well, this farmer is still in business this year and I bought from him last year, so I must have done something good. But it also might just see that you see more people working in jobs related to the food industry. The ones that are harder for people to feel confident about, the lower scores, are that it has an impact on the environment or that it has an impact on social fairness. And if you think about it, that's because there's so many degrees of separation between what they see in their community and knowing that they've actually led to that change. And the environmental one is particularly troubling for organic because that is one of the dimensions it scores very well in, is that people feel like it could be good for the environment, but people feel it's very hard for them to be confident they're doing anything when they purchase organic. That's a challenge for the industry. Another study we did added the taste dimension into this because sometimes that matters for people. So with an apple experiment, we actually went through a series of auctions and also asked people their perceptions of some statements about organics and local and some of the pros and cons of those supply chains. Again, I'm going to go through it quickly. And we had all types of apples included in that experiment. And what we found is the first experiment was they hadn't tasted the apple yet. They were just shown a label. And what you can see is that obviously organic and local labels combined were the most valued among our participants. And here they actually spent dollars. We paid them $20 to come, but if they bid and they won, they actually had to buy it. So we feel confident about these because they actually had to put their money where their mouth was, unlike a survey. The first experiment was with those three apples, organic, non-local, non-organic local, and organic local. And you can see the premiums assigned to apples in those dimensions. In the second experiment, we shared some of the facts we found in literature about pros and cons of organic and local production systems. And really, no one budged very much on those. In the third one, we revealed the results of their blind taste test, where they had already ranked the apples by taste and texture and the things the food scientists measure. And what we found here, it was interesting, is if they found out that the apple they were already bidding on, they liked, they upped their bid. But if they found out their favorite wasn't the one they were bidding on, they stayed the same place. They anchored. So once they had in their head what they wanted for an apple, if they got good news about it, they increased their bid and would pay more. But if they found out it wasn't exactly their favorite apple, and actually most of the apples fared well, they were all good apples, they anchored. They say, well, I'm still here. And that what we found is interesting. People are really anchoring in their food values. Unless there's a huge, our problem now, the food scientists tell me, is I should have really picked a clunker apple, an awful apple. I didn't know that. I always look for good looking apples. So now I've learned my shopping tricks that I should have had a really bad apple, and I didn't. Another experiment we did, and this was just with labels, not products, is we actually made up some clamshell leaf packaging labels, and again, changed all those claims, just like we looked at the experiment before. And what was interesting in this one was we found the same differentiation. Consumers are all over the board. People are valuing things very differently. But the most highly valued standalone attributes are health claims, and that's probably not surprising to anybody. And what was interesting is organic did not fare well in this experiment unless it was bundled with a health claim. When it was bundled with the health claim, it not only got a premium for itself, but it got more of a premium for the health claim than the health claim got standing alone. That's just a complicated way of saying organic confuses people, but if you add another piece of information about what it is in addition to organic, it kind of accelerates the premium they're willing to pay. And that opens up a whole realm of research for the organic community to come up with some solid metrics about what they can say about their products, other benefits to the environment, health. In this case, it was just health we were looking at. But it's not faring as well as it could alone, even though we've seen great growth with it. And this leads to this lovely article that I got too many phone calls on, and I'd explain to people, this is not my science, I'm an economist, but there was the huge controversy on whether organic foods were healthier or not. And that is not my science, so I cannot weigh in. I think it's a complex enough set of meta-analysis they looked at that really what they came up with is not always, but it doesn't have to be always. And it should not stop anyone's journey of trying to figure out if for their innovation and their product type and their patent and their product design and their production system, it could still be health benefits. This just says, just don't assume it. Always look for evidence, and consumers are getting savvy about this. The one experiment we did do up there, how am I on time? I'm good. Is that it may not be as direct as we're thinking about. So in the experiments we've done up in CSU, it may be that organic itself doesn't make things more healthy, but using an organic production system or a local organic production system and going back to some of the heritage cultivars or breeds, if you're talking about livestock, that didn't necessarily get chosen to do well in the Green Revolution model of agriculture, that's where you might get the gains. So we looked at melons, and if you used an organic production system and local distribution where things didn't have to hold for 6 weeks, they just had to hold for a week, you could go back to cultivars that maybe had health benefits that we had kind of bred away from because they didn't hold for 6 weeks or transport as well or do as well in response to fertilization schemes we were using. So what the real interesting dimension here is how much we'll reinvent our ag system and go back to some of the things that might have been disregarded or become less important in the marketplace because these new systems allow for that. And anyone who's gone to Boulder Farmers Market has seen that come to fruition and tried whole cultivars they'd never even known about before. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so what does this mean for opportunities? I just went through a bunch of consumer research, and my high points on that are people are really different. And you don't need to go and tell a whole bunch of people to get different. There's enough becoming different and looking for organic products on their own. But what they need from you is they need assurances. You need to do everything as an industry in your power to build up that perceived consumer effectiveness of the outcome they're hoping to get by investing in an organic diet, if that's already where they're leaning, that you can give them proof, evidence, good research to show they are actually they're contributing to that outcome. And the great thing is the USDA is finally investing more and more research dollars to actually, we'll hear about this afternoon, to allow that kind of research to happen. And again, as Kathy and Greg said, you don't have to force it then. If consumers see it, they continue to grow this segment, the supply side is already going to be incentivized if it makes sense for them. But let's also pay attention to the fact it's not going to make sense to everybody ever. And there's a few reasons for that. A lot of this depends on either shorter supply chains or a different set of supply chains than people are used to. And people get anchored. Just like those consumers got anchored, businesses get anchored. And there's their way of doing business. These short supply chains are very labor intensive. That's great news for economic development because it means more jobs. It's bad news for the bottom line because it means more cost. But again, I always get mad when people say, oh, we can't let labor costs go up. And it's like, I swear half of our economic development strategy in this country right now is to come up with good jobs. So it's okay to have more labor intensive systems if the labor intensity is used on smart things that matter to people. Don't go creating jobs and work that you don't need. And the truth is the case with organic too. The organic isn't always shorter supply chains. And by short supply chains, I mean people who want fewer degrees of separation between who produce their food and when they got it. And we have a very schizophrenic set of consumers. They want that, yet they want something fully processed into ready-to-eat food. So it's very hard to tell people the right thing to do. There's a lot of different right things to do. But you also have to realize there are people who still are willing to substitute away from short supply chains and knowing their farmer because they trust the third-party certifications of things like organic and other people who are experts telling them this was produced in a manner that is aligned with your values. And so both of those are going to continue to operate simultaneously, both shorter supply chains and third-party certifications, but they're still both going to be a minority compared to the traditional food system, which is driven by that 57% of people where price is everything to them. You're not going to change those people right now. Their current circumstances or values or whatever that's what's important to them. But there's an increasing share of people who these other two things matter, and different models of agriculture going on in this county, in this state, serve those markets well. So this is a topology a group called the Ag of the Middle Research Group came up with, kind of showing this in a more schematic way. So we have the commodity system, and this looks like they're all the same size, but as Greg showed, the commodity system is still the hyper majority supply chain for food in the United States. On the opposite quadrant, you have the direct marketing people, those small, great, young, beginning farmer producers or other producers who've chosen, I want to feed my community. And they're great and they're growing, and we're going to see more growth in this census, but they're still a very small minority. In this state, we might be approaching 10%. We're going to see with this ag census. That would be my best guess. The problem with that model and with all the farmers we see going through our beginning farmer program, which we call Building Farmers, and that you guys helped us pilot here in this county, 7 years ago, and now we're still going. What we see though is they all get to a point when they need to get commercially viable. These other versions of ag had to be part of their portfolio. And the most common one we talk about is value food chains. And that's where organic lies, that's where farm to school lies, that's where food hubs lie, that's where they start growing. But when they start recreating that distribution system, they rethink how they can build it, again, either to improve the perceived consumer effectiveness of supporting the things their consumers in the farmers market want to support, even if it has to ramp up to wholesale. But what we want to keep people out of is the fact that if you can't be big enough to be at the commodity level anymore, and Cathay talked about the fragmentation of land, what we're trying to keep people out of is the trouble zone, where if you don't have some kind of value proposition, whether it's organic or local or humane treatment of animals, or I think the most recent one I saw is barn roaming quails. If you're not one of those value propositions, you can't be small. And so if you only have access to small amounts of resources and capital, you have to stay out of that. So when we're bumping people to those other models at CSU, it's because of their current scale or their value system makes those two models fit, but it doesn't mean that the commodity model doesn't stay as well. So we're now taking this schematic made by someone else and making it more complex, because that's what we do. And so you'll see it's really going to end up being a whole circle of things, because even within the direct marketing quadrant, there's several different models that are working. And within the value food chain quadrant, there's several models working. And so what we're really trying to figure out is some benchmarking and some advice and some best practices, like Greg said, of what the best versions of those models look like, and realizing they're going to all coexist in this food market, because just as heterogeneous as our consumers are, our models of food production and supply chains and consumption are probably just as heterogeneous. So we want to have the best farmers doing every version of that model possible, and try to lower as many barriers as we can for them doing any of those models well. Except, obviously, we didn't put it in the trouble zone. I was tempted just to be ornery, but I decided not to. So I'm going to end with that, and just end with the real take home from this is we have a complex marketing landscape. We at CSU have been trying our very best on the consumer research side to add a little bit of insight about what's driving people. And then on the technical assistance side, helping people find the best practices for all the different models that look like they have to exist. I hope that was informative.
Very good. And less technical problems than the Governor's Forum on Colorado Agriculture.
Yes, no technical problems.
No problems. Questions? If you have any, Jen and Megan are walking around collecting. Please pass to the center. We have one here for Dawn. If the county hits its 20% goal for organic on the 14,000 acres of cropland is our target, does that product also stay local within Boulder County?
That is an interesting question, and I thought I'd get what I hadn't thought about before. Luckily, I've thought about that one before. But that's the challenge of what Greg and Cathay shared with you. You guys are becoming a hub nationally for innovative food production. So part of the discussion has to be, is that where do you want it to stay local? I think you've done everything in your power as a county to keep as much of it as local as possible, to rebalance where some of your acreage is going to better meet the needs that you've seen at farmers markets or roadside stands or retailers or restaurants who want things. But I guess part of the discussion is if you want it to stay local, because then it starts feeling a little bit like we're Boulder County and we're lucky to live here and we have that great view and we have great food and we want to keep it to ourselves, or a lot of your companies are sharing it nationally and giving other people access. So it's a good question. when we go through the best practice type of discussion with the farmers we give technical assistance to, we basically see it as a portfolio. You want to keep a solid set here, especially for those products where it matters, fresh produce, dairy. You have to have a big discussion about whether short supply chains matter as much for bakery, or if they matter as much for beverages. Celestial Seasonings is here, but we know that tea, very little of it, if any, is local. So a discussion is really what's the right portfolio, and what things does it matter most to consumers have short supply chains. And again, that's something we work on, and mostly what we've seen is it's primarily fresh produce and an increasingly meat product. Short supply chains are where they're valued the most. We don't see it as much on processed goods at all.
Any other paper questions? Okay.
See, they got all the hard ones. You guys are awesome.
You answered all the questions. Fantastic.
Well, I'm around all day and at lunch, so if you do have questions, and there's publications behind everything I put up here, so if you want to delve deeper in anything I talked about, I can probably hook you up with that. So.
Thank you, Dawn. We have one? Okay.
We're keeping them from lunch. I'll be fast.
I know. Whoever's in front of lunch is always tough, right? On your labeling survey, what was the composition of your subjects? This is natural grocers customers consider the USDA organic seal as the most important front of package info, second only to ingredients.
Yep. So we always make sure we have a representative sample. Usually that the rural-urban mix is right, that the income mix is right, and that the education mix is right. That's the things we think matter most to purchasing decisions. So, like I said, it's a very diverse group. For that 11 to 13%, you're right. They have priorities that are much different than the other 75%, and then there's another 18% in there that different things matter. So for every individual group, there is a different priority for them. But again, we started out with going into mass, and that's why we started breaking out by marketing channels. We found out people do behave very differently depending on what marketing channel they're in. So that's, I guess, the other take home I should have given you is it all depends where you're marketing, how you pick the right best practices and best ways to interact with your consumers, because they're now self-selecting by how they shop, how they think. Good question.
One more. Do you foresee an organic commodities market being needed or possible? Would that nullify the short supply chain or the local identity?
I do see one probably coming. A lot of our terminal markets that we look at for prices, if you're geeky like me and hang out in places like that on the web, they already do have organic segments more consistently showing up in a lot of terminal markets for a lot of products. In terms of a commodity markets for futures trading, I don't know that we want one. If you mean a commodities market for there being so much supply chain maturity that we can always have clamshells of spinach in our store, we're getting mostly there. I don't think that takes away any of the market opportunities for the people looking for short supply chains, because again, consumers are voting with their dollars and they're buying in the way that's conducive to them. But for the people who are the third-party certification is enough for them, they are happy to get it as available in as many places as they buy foods as possible, and that requires a commodities market. So we're going to see both exist at the same time and possibly even complement each other. Because you could think of organics is sometimes called the gateway drug to other sustainable systems. I don't think I get in trouble with saying that. In Colorado now you have to be careful how you say anything, but you know, it's often the thing that opens people's eyes. And even though it seems opposite of like, well, if they can find it in their own store, they're never going to seek it out. There's a lot of evidence that people are first trying stuff in the store, that's having them have different conversations, read different labels, learn more about companies, and driving them back to shorter supply chains sometimes, depending on if the organic is enough for them. Never underestimate the heterogeneity and diversity of consumers out there. It's immense. So, done?
So you touched on the social media aspect in this. Here's a question about why is there a why is there a sufficient lack of effective social media as a majority of organic ag marketing mix, especially since we know with proper education and implementation, social media, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, it's all free. Why don't we see more of it?
I don't know that we don't see very much of it. It's considered a very active segment of the social media. I mean, okay, it's not up there with whatever Justin Bieber is doing, and I think we're okay with that. I actually should.
The effective part too.
Yeah, I actually should have put it up because there's starting to be some metrics that you can look at out there. But the food system, social media, and Google trending and all of that, it's high and significant. I showed one schematic at our extension forum this year where we all think of the Farm Bill as being a big thing. Well, that's just a bunch of geeky ones of us who track the Farm Bill. If you actually looked at the searches for farmers markets compared to Farm Bill, it's orders of magnitude bigger for farmers markets. There is a lot of social media and internet energy around food systems right now. So I'm surprised someone said that, because actually that's considered among a lot of people as one of the really dynamic parts of social media right now.
Do you think it's effective?
You know, well, it depends what you call effective. In this era of tribal marketing, they call it. I don't do a ton with social media, but maybe I need to start, it sounds like. In the idea of tribal media, where people believe their friends and their peers more than they believe their corporate sponsors of ads. What? Or the government. Yeah, well, although relative to the world, actually, there's more faith in our government than in food systems than most countries of the world. That doesn't mean it's perfect, but I know it's all different people's different perceptions. But we can do research on that. But most concept is that has been effective. And if you ask farmers who particularly are direct marketing or doing some part of value chain now, they'll actually say they know their investments in that kind of advertising is far more effective than anything they could do buying any print ads or radio ads. A few people will push back on that, but I would say it's actually been, it's helped become a new best practice for very cost-effective marketing for a lot of our people we talk to. This is the great thing about being in extension and research. I see what people are doing, I see who's succeeding financially, and then I can choose some of the stuff I tell people they should be doing and make sure I'm not wrong most of the time. So, but good question, and it's probably worth a research project, and I guess I'll go map that one out next.
So Don, you have seen in your career the rise of raw milk in Colorado.
Yep.
The Raw Milk Association of Colorado is still in play. We see some demands of that in the marketplace for raw milk. What can we see the dynamic tension between USDA requirements for pasteurization and that growing demand for raw milk? How can we see more raw milk growth in the market in Colorado?
Well, I think it's an awesome question to start and then leave for Mark to finish up, because there's a federal perspective on this as well. And that's that USDA is in the job of doing grades and standards. They think there's compelling evidence that there's a public health threat from raw milk. I'm not sure if you don't talk to some of the biggest raw milk producers, they don't agree that there could be a public health threat from raw milk. So it's kind of a weird tension, similar probably to what happened with organics way back, of there's a set of people doing it and wanting it to be able to expand and have less barriers, but they also would tell you, but people should do it our way. Because if they don't do it our way, it could be a slippery slope, lower the standards for raw milk. And so I think there's actually way more complications there than you think, because I know, we have Windsor up by us. You have 2 vets running that who know how to monitor animal health very fully, very thoroughly, many times a day. They're, of course, wanting to have opportunities to grow that model into something more viable for a bigger value chain, but at the same time, they'll point to everybody they think is doing it wrong. And that's the USDA problem, is when they open the door, they have to open the door to everybody and have the budget to monitor everybody's being as careful as those out there with best practices. So even the people who really want raw milk to grow, I think they have to be careful that it has to be a very thoughtful, stakeholder-driven process, because it could go terribly awry, and that's by the admittance of people who are actually in that sector right now. So USDA currently, as they want to seem to support monitoring and regulating industries, I don't think they could support a raw milk system. Oh, that would be FDA? But USDA wouldn't put it under one of their ag marketing service programs either, as a third-party certification?
The whole question is the safety of raw milk.
Oh, would be FDA.
It's FDA's domain, USDA doesn't touch that.
So it hasn't been a USDA decision at all whether it's been allowable?
Correct.
Oh, I was wrong. And so in this state, I guess I should have known that because CDPHE is the agency that's had most of its discussion on that. So, see, that's why you don't ask an economist about something that has to do with public health. But I guess I would just, and back to the discussion about whether you trust the government. I think some people feel it wouldn't monitor right, but I'm also for consumer choice. And I think some consumers have gone to a lot of extra effort to get raw milk because they felt that strongly about it. So the choice problem is if we put barriers to people who slightly want it but aren't willing to go to the trouble to actually own a share of a cow. And I guess I don't have anything else intelligent to say about that, but it is complex for many reasons, and it would require government intervention, and that might not be what the government can handle well. But Mark might tell me something different.
Thank you, Don.
Sorry. Why'd you give that one to me last? I was doing so good.
We try to be inclusive with the questions if we can. Yeah, so.